Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit slowly to begin with, for the benefit of anybody who's still trying to dial in or might be a few minutes late. But I do want to kick off now and run through this presentation. And towards the end, we'll have a short opportunity for questions and answers and a little bit more discussion. But this session in general is focused on this concept of form and function and the competition between the two of them within proofreading, and with a special focus on the product contract companion. So just to give you a little bit of insight as to what we're going to be running through today. So first is this concept of form and function, how they relate, where they come from, and then how this affects us as a vendor for legal software, what this means in terms of our features and how they break down, and also how we came to the ability to have this discussion. So some of the things that we've been doing in the background regarding the usage of our products and understanding better what we're getting from the product and in the market. Then what we're seeing, so that will just be a breakdown of different features and what we're seeing in regards to that and how that links back to form and function, and also some of the trends that this can tell us. And then towards the end, what this data actually tells us and how we can use it, as well as some of the things that can be taken away from this session. And as an agenda, that's sort of it, but there's also the fact that towards the end, there'll be opportunity for Q&A. At any point, don't feel restricted by that session. If you want to insert a question into the chat, then you can, and I'll come to that at the end. So feel free to write that down as you think of it. Just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Theo Lister. I'm a product manager at Litera Microsystems, and I work mainly on Contract Companion as well as on some of our other products, which are Litigation Companion and Clause Companion. Today, I'm going to be keeping this discussion centered just around Contract Companion. And now I'll move on to the core of things. I see a few people joined in the interim, so thank you for joining, and good to have you here. So, form versus function. This is an argument that's kind of been going on for the ages, but it really reached prominence with a person called Louis Sullivan. And you can see there's a lot of high rhetoric here, a lot of poetic talk, but what this boils down to is the assertion that form follows function. So the fact that something looks nice isn't as important as the fact that it provides a core benefit. And Sullivan was an architect, and that's where this discussion kind of kicked off in popular culture. But of course, it's morphed and it's moved along, and we have a little bit more of a stern and ironclad response from Bleckley Justice, her lawyer, which is that the fact that form exists leads to order. So they're not necessarily conflicting approaches to this argument, but it does mean that there are proponents for each, and towards the end, I'll be offering a little bit of a muted approach to this concept and saying that the two rely on each other. So I hope I'm not surprising anybody by having a more moderate reaction to this debate. But I hope I did surprise a few people by incorporating a little poetry into what might have just been a tech demonstration. So this is where the argument relates to us. So those of you who are familiar with Contract Companion, and I will show a little bit of the product later to show what it does and what some of these features relate to. But you can see there is a breakdown in the way that we have philosophically been approaching the product between form and function, and then the fusion of the two. So form might correspond to things like the consistent styling of definitions. So not that the way they are legally interpreted, not the way that we're defining them, but the way that we're just modeling them so that they can be more easily seen in a document. Sentence spacing is something that gets people very impassioned and very loud and sometimes angry. But that is, I would argue, more a matter of form than a matter of function. It doesn't affect the interpretation of legal standards. It affects the style and the readability of a document. Then there's placeholder formatting, quotation mark formats, things like that. For function, we tend to classify things of function, which are things that affect the actual legal interpretation of what's been written down. So definitions, if you are consistently referring to something that you've defined, if you forget to do that, if you do it incorrectly, that can have an effect on legal interpretation. In court, somebody could read this and get to an entirely different conclusion as to the drafter's original intent. Other types of defined term issues fall into that bucket as well. Then there are things with cross-referencing, so making sure that when you refer to a particular clause or section in your document, that's what you meant to do. And if you refer to something that's incorrect, that could affect what somebody could read into that document as well at a later point, potentially in court. Then there's numerical amounts, making sure that if you do want to sell shares for a certain share purchase price, that's the number that you write down. Something like that is less legally involved, but it is still hard fact, and it needs to be checked to make sure it's correct. And then there's a little bit of both. So there's benefits from each camp here. So document numbering schemes, the way things look is one thing, but document numbering schemes do so much more than that, and that's why I've included it in this bucket. The automation of cross-references is something that we always advise upon. It's better to have something automated so that if you move to parts of your document and things change, your references are up to date. But the core of the matter is, if you get that right, even if they're manually typed, it still has the right function. And then there's incomplete items, which is a form of checking for things that haven't yet been negotiated or haven't been filled out. So you can see we straddle the line in terms of form and function. It's an argument that has made its way into our software, and moving on, you'll see that there's differing approaches to this. So getting on to Contract Companion, the product itself, you can see here, this is a little bit of what it looks like when you open it up in Microsoft Word. So towards the top of the screen, we have how you can actually launch the product from the Word ribbon. And then towards the right-hand side, you can see the individual features. So if you click into any of these features, then it will show you the results that software has found across all of these different categories. Some of those categories were broken down just earlier, but you can see there are quite a lot of features, and we tried to make it a very feature-rich product. But having regards to the argument of form versus function, we broke it down into several subcategories. And it's good to have that, but what we also wanted to make sure is the fact that the form of the software, or the user interface, or the user experience, as they tend to be referred to now, making sure there's easier ways of accessing this information to increase the adoption and increase the usage. So in that way, the form of the product makes sure that people are more easily able to access the functions of the product. One of the first things we did there was just making sure there's shortcuts to functionality. Removing just one click can have so much of an effect on somebody using your software and getting actionable results out of it. So the defined term checker, you can see up here, we just incorporated things into the ribbon so that people can access them immediately. So definitions and defined term issues, they've been aggregated and put into a separate ribbon button. Cross-references, they need to be checked, but they can be accessed from up here as well. And then final checks, editing mistakes and incomplete items, making sure that they're aggregated and they can be checked as well. So this is a very brief introduction to the concept, but ease of use has so much of an effect on the function of a product. They're almost fused in terms of this argument between the two of them. It does, however, and we'll come to this in a little bit, when it comes to usage data and our story there, the grouping of these items has an effect on how we interpret this data. So usage data, and you will probably have seen this at some points. Microsoft has crash reports, things like that. If something goes wrong on your computer, it will often say, we're sending a message to a central server just to say why this crashed and why it happened. And hopefully that will give our engineers the information they need to make sure it doesn't happen again. And that was our initial way of focusing on this. Usage was very much a diagnostic tool to work out where things were going wrong and how we could improve the software technically, rather than approaching it from a user perspective and seeing how people use things best and how we could tweak things. And that's the common first step that people use when addressing things like this. But then we moved along. So the next step was extending this diagnostic tool to focus on feature use. And you can see a little bit of this on the right-hand side of the screen. So all of these things here in these cells, they're categorized as events. So every time an event happens, and when we've talked to our customer and made sure they're happy to have this usage information being tracked, then we can know about that. And then finally, moving from that, working with our customers to provide this information so that they know what's being used, they know how much it's being used, and then we can focus on the best ways to make sure that people are aware that the software is available and they're getting full use out of it. And of course, one of the things we've had to bear in mind all the way throughout this is maintaining confidentiality, making sure we're not taking information that our clients don't want us to have. And the core fact of that is we never get information about what's actually in people's documents, about what people environments are. It's all about what people have done with the software. So which button they've clicked, and you can see on the right hand side, this is the information we get. So we'll get, say, tile opened, all results happened 2 times, things like that. So there's a level of anonymization of information, which means that we can do things with this information, but we don't know everything. So here is, once again, the product, and then we can go into some of the information that we have about it. So here is overall usage counts. So what this means is, one of the metrics we track is how often are each of these features used over a full term. So I took some of the information we have over an entire month, took it together, took the average, and then worked out some of this information. So for the defined term checker, the cross-reference checker, and final checks, you see up there, this is the split. So over the use of every feature, the split for them was that 8.4% of the use was just the defined term checker alone, then 4.3 for the cross-reference checker, 6.6 for final checks. So one of the findings here is, and this relates back to our early discussion of form and function, improving the form of the product to promote accessibility to the functions, it's that 20% of access to all the features of the product happens straight here, straight from the ribbon. So that means when we didn't have that beforehand, people were either clicking analyze and accessing all of these features individually, or we may have lost that use entirely. That's one of the things that we can't know, but at least we do know that having this functionality available improves people's ability to access information. Then we have the risk assessment up here. So that gets 4.1% of the use. Definitions themselves, 2.9, and so on and so on. So you can see here a relatively low proportion of the total for these features, less than 5%. However, defined term issues and editing mistakes really gets a lot of the bulk of this information. And defined term issues, as I showed earlier, is aggregated into the defined term checker, but these values are completely separate. So 18.8% of use clicking this tile, and then adding to that, 8.4% of use is clicking this tile as well. So overall, that's above 25% of all use focuses on content which has defined term issues in that. That was something that we thought. We'd always assumed that defined term issues gets a lot of traffic because that was one of the first things we focused on building. But this is a justification of that, and it tells us that we can keep building this direction, and this gets a lot of value because we can deliver a lot of value if we focus on this feature above others. But then editing mistakes has 16% as well, and that is also aggregated within final checks. So this is also a very heavy duty feature. And the reason these two are so interesting is because defined term issues relates very, very strictly to the function of, say, a legal agreement. It's very based on legal interpretation, whereas editing mistakes is far more focused on the form. So our initial entry into this field, and this was quite a while ago, but we wanted something to help check the legal interpretation of documents. Then later on, we built in things to focus on the editing mistakes, thinking it would be an interesting value add. But what we're now finding is the overall use of those two features is pretty split, it's quite even. So there's clearly an argument for each of form and function in the analysis and the correction of legal documents. And then we have a little bit more information about some of our other features. We can also record different things. So previously that was the overall use, and this is the session amount. So this is a slightly different metric. So, and I don't want to go through each thing line by line, but ultimately this reflects the total use across all users, but just for sessions. So in a particular session, when a user loads up Contract Companion, we want to know how consistently they use certain features. So not overall, because somebody might, for instance, just open up the product and only use one feature. And that's what sessions sort of tends to track. The numbers don't vary too much, but there is a little variation, and we can do some interesting analysis on that later. And then there's user count. So this is a bit more distinct because this gives us information about the split of different users, what they focus on. And I'll come to that later as well. So in terms of the information that this presents us with, there's quite a little bit that we can analyze. So you saw that the risk assessment has a use of around 4% in total. That's not particularly high, and it occupies quite a large visual area in the product. But that doesn't mean we need to dismiss things just because they have low use compared to certain other features. Because this is a visual indicator, you don't need to click on something to get value out of it, particularly if it has a visual indication. Integrating into the word ribbon, so giving people the opportunity to jump straight into something, saving clicks can have a huge effect because it increases people's capacity to use things. This is an interesting one. So there's a split here. So checking your definitions, checking they're consistent is different to checking for discrete errors. Of course, software makes it much easier to find potential errors because we can do pattern matching. Reading a definition, understanding it, and making sure it's being properly applied, that's much more difficult, and that requires a person who's intimately familiar with what's happening and what's been defined to understand that. But this could be concealed because we saw a lot of use through the defined term checker, which aggregates the definitions into itself. So this could be data that's being missed just because it's being accessed somewhere else. Incomplete items and editing mistakes, again, they are grouped together under final checks, so this could be missed. But what it could also mean is that checking for incomplete items is a very discrete check that doesn't happen all that much. It might happen once at the start of a matter, once at the end of a matter, and then it's resolved. Whereas editing mistakes is something that people are concerned about on a continual basis. And then we can use this different metrics that we're tracking. So individual user use compared to the overall, it can reveal certain power users to us. So here, the split between editing mistakes, there's a certain amount of unique users checking this, but they comprise more than the amount that they are in terms of total product use. So they're overusing certain features. And that's true for editing mistakes, and also true for defined term issues. A little more that we know is that the all results button doesn't see much use. And that's for the best. It's a focused review of issues is far more effective than viewing simply everything and trying to wade through it. It helps with focus, and it helps with reducing text switching. So we're happy this is the case, and we want to encourage the use of this more. Low usage of reports. Printing a separate standalone report of the information rather than viewing it on screen in the product. This is another thing that we're quite happy with. We always want to incentivize people using the software on their PC so they can change things in their document if they need to when it's right then and there. However, this usage tracking is all electronically based. If you print off a paper report, pass that over to somebody and they get value out of that, they use that paper report as the basis of their decision making. There's no way for us to track that. So there is potential value being passed along that we simply can't track, and we need to be aware of that. Ultimately, high interaction with fixing, flagging, and ignoring. If you give somebody the capacity to correct a mistake, they will do it. That was something I think most of us would assume already, but here's a little bit of proof. People like to manually refresh the results, and we introduced a feature which automatically refreshes results quite a while ago, but people still like that measure of control. Taking that away might lead to some level of confusion if they don't know there's an automatic refresh. So we left it in. And sorting and filtering. So this gets used a lot as well. And this relates back to form. So the way that you present results is important because it improves the accessibility to that information. And here we're seeing a lot of people using the sorting and filtering functions, and that supports that thesis. So now we have all this information. We have a few theories, what we actually do with it. So I alluded to this earlier, and it's worth bearing in mind again that making decisions just on the fact that you have data can lead to flaws, because you can see previously I had 2 slides full of information based on data, but they are still at the core of them assumptions which need to be explored further. So using data as a starting point to inform discussion is the best way of using this information. So it lets us ask the right questions, it lets us promote conversations, it lets us learn more, and it lets us use qualitative data to prove quantitative data and vice versa. It lets us work out the multiple types of people that work in the software. Initially, the product was focused towards just lawyers, but we see it's not just lawyers using it. The breakdown of power users intimates things like that to us, and that informs us. It allows us to have discussions with the different people who use the software, and we find there's a breakdown so that lawyers might not check their editing mistakes as much. The secretaries might use editing mistakes more, check defined term issues less. And it helps us identify that what power users focus on, and in turn, that allows us to focus on particular features and deliver higher value. So I just want to wrap this all up, provide a neat little bow on what I've been discussing. I've been dancing around this issue quite a bit, but we discovered effectively that focusing just on the lawyer stuff isn't ideal. We can deliver value by focusing on different areas where we see high product use. And that's particularly true in terms of editing mistakes, which historically we treated as something as more based on form, but form is quite important when it comes to delivering value. And I mentioned there's lots of different people involved in this process, and lawyers rely on this. Law firms rely on this. It's very rare that one person takes a matter all the way from the start to the end without getting any external help. So working out how we can facilitate that, how we can help people collaborate with each other, and how we can adapt to different circumstances means that we'll be delivering better value to the market. And ultimately, brand is involved as well. So making sure that a document is pristine, is well legally reasoned, that's the brand of the lawyer that's delivering that content. But at a wider level, making sure that all of that delivered work product follows certain standards, of course of high legal quality, but also certain stylistic qualities, certain tweaks, certain marketing. That's all the law firm's brand, and focusing on that is important. So actually, the fact that the form is consistent can have a high value on making sure that clients are retained, clients are interested in accessing the function that that form is the boilerplate template for. And of course, presenting things well means people use it. That might be boiled down to it, the simplest part of this and kind of the overarching theme. Even if something works tremendously well, if it looks really bad and it's difficult to use, it's not going to get as much use. People might still use it if it's good enough, but there's no reason to rely just on the function when you can improve the form at the same time. And the inverse of that, if something looks really good but it doesn't work, people won't use it. And we need to keep both in mind when developing software. So in terms of that level of information, I want to pause there. I have a little bit more to discuss, but for the time being, I want to break and allow anybody who hasn't already to ask questions, and I'm going to check the questions myself. So actually, I've got one from right at the start when I cracked out a little poem. So it says, you mentioned lawyers and architects at the start. Have you considered this for other areas? And I'm assuming that the other areas here means the different disciplines, because that was one person was an architect, one person was a lawyer. Obviously, we're more focused on the lawyer side of things, but this argument isn't restricted just to those two disciplines. It carries out into quite a few different areas, and actually maybe the most pertinent for us is software design. That's a huge area for this. I intimated to that earlier that a good user interface and user experience helps people access the functionality of the software, and it just means that our core features get used more if they're presentable and they're easily accessible. A question, how do we get this usage information? So you probably won't want it in the form that I displayed just then, but we do. If you are working with us, then work with your customer success manager, work with your regular key contact at Latera Microsystems. We need to work with you to see if you can send us this information, if we can track this, and there needs to be a little bit of a talk with the technical team if it's not already switched on, but it should be relatively simple. And then we can show you some of this information. We can look at most popular features, how many people are using it, things like that. If we need to dive a little bit deeper into it, maybe we can. It won't be the manner in which I presented this information, but there definitely is the capacity to find out some of this information yourself as well. So if you need that, please take advantage of it. And I'm not seeing anything else. So just to move on. So this session has been about the concept of form versus function, and that's related just to Contract Companion. And of course, this is a timeless debate almost. So it's not just restricted to that one product. And we won't be covering that per se in extreme depth, but Contract Companion will come back next month as part of the check workflow. And at Latera Microsystems, we put a lot of effort into talking about the document drafting lifecycle. And check and collaborate are two parts of that process. They complement each other. And so we'll be back next month on October the 11th. And you can use our website to access that, to sign up for it. So we'll be talking more about our products and also more about user workflows. So stay tuned for that. And finally, thank you. This is a picture of a man. It's not me, but if you do want to talk to me, I have my email address there. So feel free, if there are any questions that went unanswered or anything that you think of afterwards, you can send it there. Or if you need help or support in general, please feel free to contact our support line. So if there's nothing else, thank you everybody for joining. I will wind things up now, but thank you and I hope you have a great day. Goodbye, everyone.